well. Talking about the title that you can see here, Not All Queens, Saints and Goddesses, I talk on this quite a lot because I'm a City of London guide. And about 3 years ago, I was giving a lot of guided tours of the city because it was a centenary of women's suffrage. And I took a group of City of London elected officers, and I was having problems, I had to confess, talking to them about ordinary women in the city because there are no real signs of them. All of the statues are queens, saints, and goddesses. Well, I say goddesses, what I really mean is rather nubile young ladies falling out of dresses, holding improbable bunches of bananas, and there are quite a lot of those in the City of London, but very little representation of ordinary women. Now, this is quite strange because consider, if you will, that apart from the early Roman period, when we had a very large garrison of big hairy soldiers in the city, up until the Great Fire of London, the larger number of residents of the City of London were women. And in fact, there are points during the City of London's history when the city was actually largely populated by women, for example, during the Civil War, but there's very little sign of them. And one is often asked why. Well, there are a number of reasons. And what I'm going to do today is just talk about a few examples of groups of women or actual women, some of whom are not very famous, which give you an idea of how involved in City of London history and life women were. Now I'm going to move on to another thing that happened to me. Hopefully you can see that phrase. Again, about 3 years ago, somebody had been talking about this issue, and someone turned around to me and said, well, until recently, women didn't really have much of an effect on the city. Well, it's not true that women didn't have an effect on the city. It's just that most of them aren't recorded unless they're really dramatic. For example, here we have Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, arriving in London in AD 61. She promptly burns the place to the ground, kills any unfortunate residents still there, and to this day we have a line of charred earth beneath our feet in London. And really, you couldn't really have much more of an effect on a city than razing the place to the ground. Now, having spoken about Boudica, I thought the logical place to start this evening was with Roman London and a Roman girl. And here you can see I've worked out you are the glass sellers, so I've decided to show you some nice Roman glass from the period. Please don't ask me about it, but it was dug up in London. Now, looking at these pictures, you might be forgiven for thinking that it's going to be a talk on disaster and mayhem. And of course, there are some photos here of a very dark day in City of London history. On the April the 10th, 1992, the IRA detonated a huge bomb at the site of the Baltic Exchange, and it caused massive damage and killed 3 people. But as ever, even in the worst day, there is always a silver lining. And this silver lining was for our army of diggers, our archaeologists, who set to work looking at all the marvellous things that had been turned up by the bomb. And in the bottom left picture, you can actually see those are actually Roman brick remains beneath one of the streets. Now, one of the remarkable things they did find was a skeleton. And having said that women's history is buried, I thought it might be a good idea to talk about someone who was actually literally buried, because near where the Gherkin stands today, they found the skeleton of a young Roman girl. Now, they know she was buried properly because she was laid out very similar to the skeleton you can see in the slide. They laid people out in a very particular way. The skeleton of the girl didn't have those beautiful vases, but she had some pottery shards and a few scraps of jewellery. So she wasn't abandoned, she wasn't just dropped there. She was buried utterly on purpose. We know that she was put in the ground somewhere between the ages of 13 and 15 or 16, and we know more or less when. It would have been towards the end of the 300s, maybe about 380 AD, or even later. So towards the end of the Roman period in London. That much we know, but very little else we know. And here I want to show, this is a picture of Roman London, and the skeleton would have been to the uh, far right of this screen. You can see the square that was the forum inside the Roman wall. And this is where things become very curious, because one thing the Romans never did was bury someone inside the city walls. You can see from this image, this imagining of the Roman Bishopsgate, if you look at the top, you can see the cemetery. The other thing that was really fascinating about this girl is she seemed to be buried on her own. Now, admittedly, over the centuries, graves and bodies get moved around, but the archaeologists would have expected to find a shard of bone or something near her. This picture shows a family gathering. It was very much a group activity, burying someone. So she really is a mystery girl. However, there's quite a lot we do know about the kind of life she would have had. The image you're seeing now is taken from a mosaic of the period. It shows a woman of what we might describe as a middling sort. Not an aristocrat, quite an ordinary woman. She's wearing, it's not quite toga, it's more like a dress, and she's carrying a box and a bag. And here is a slightly more romantic image. And here again, we have another teenage girl looking out at us. She looks a little bit more ragged, maybe less well off. But obviously you can see this depiction is of a girl in a market, and it looks like she's just outside a forum, like the forum that was very close to Bishopsgate. And you can see the other women, you see children running around and women shopping, looking at ceramics. And the simple fact is that the Romans, life for Roman women was very traditional, it's very patriarchal culture. And so the man was the head of the household and women were largely concerned with the domestic arena, raising children, preparing food, running the house. Now, some of you may have seen this kitchen before because it was actually a display at the Museum of London. Now, our young girl would have been very, very lucky if she lived in here, because this is a kind of world of interiors kitchen of the Roman area, sort of small bone Roman kitchen. And one thing we don't know about the girl, of course, is we don't know what her social background is. She was buried properly, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't a slave. She could have been middle class, poor, she could have been quite well off. She's unlikely to have been rich because she wasn't buried with lots of fanfare. If she was a more ordinary Roman, rather like the reenactor looks there, she's wearing, again, clothes of the period, she would have lived in probably a tiny home. It would have been a little bigger than something we'd have as a garden shed, with possibly a workshop in the back. Now, I think all of us can sympathise with the average Roman family at the moment, because they tended to live on food that was delivered, or she'd be sent along to grab it. And some of their takeaway food sounds very familiar. Flat bread, scraped vegetables and salad is basically a pizza. Deep fried fish and batter, and extremely popular, little bits of meat on a skewer. So as you can imagine, I like to think of her sitting there and sharing a 5th century kebab with her family. Now, women's lives didn't just, however, revolve around the home. They worked. They were a very important part of the economy. In those days, you didn't get away unless you were very rich with sitting around. This is an image, it's quite humorous, and that's a barmaid in what would have been called a copa or a tabernae. Now, barmaids, if our girl was a barmaid, she was at the disreputable end of things, because barmaids had the same slightly dodgy reputation then that they have now. But actually, most Roman women were involved in general trade. Now, in this picture here in the foreground, you can see a picture of a cafe. In those holes there would have been stored stews and pickles and fish that would be ladled out and put into bowls. In the background, you can see a man in what looks like a butcher's shop. Most likely, she would have been in the front, she would have handled the money, she would have charmed the customers, and in the back, the men would have been doing the work. And that's a pattern for Roman women, that they'd man the front of shop, they'd handle the money, they'd sell the things, they'd look after the children, and in the back, the men would be doing the work. and that applied to trades like ceramics, metalwork, jewellery making, carpentry, and indeed glass blowing in the Roman era. And the interesting thing is that pattern of work for women didn't really change until the Great Fire in 1666. So the way that Roman women worked in some ways was the same way that women would continue to work in the city. Now, it wasn't all work and no fun for women in the city. You've got a picture here of a woman and a child. She's wearing a sort of plain toga. And of course, by the period in which our girl died, most Romans were Christian. And there was some encouragement for women to learn how to read and have cultural activities. On the other hand, things could still get rough. She might have liked going to the Roman amphitheatre, which of course was under the current Guildhall. This image here is of a relief that's actually in the British Museum, and the clue is in, you can just see the word maison, and that is female gladiators. Now, female gladiators were hugely popular and quite rare at the London amphitheatre because they were expensive, but they really were top of the sort of tariff if you're going to watch it. And of course, at the end, that's a view, a recreation of Bishopsgate Roman baths, to which she would almost definitely have visited that during her life. Now, rather interestingly, and I think this is quite romantic and unusually, the City of London decided to put her back almost exactly where they found her. I think there's something quite touching about this young woman that we didn't really know much about. Now, somebody mentioned Latin earlier. I am not going to read that because my Latin's dreadful, but you can see the translation on the other side. And you can go and visit that memorial, and in the ground, you can see where they've laid the body. There's a little laurel leaf on the top. And something also that has a real sense of the way that history is circular in the city and how very disparate things are connected is, a not far away from her is another memorial. This is a memorial to the 3 people who were killed in that terrible explosion that I started by discussing. And in the middle, we have another teenager who lived or knew London well, and that was Danielle Carter, who was tragically killed. It's quite interesting to think of Danielle being there, so close to our own Roman girl. They're separated by absolute centuries, but they're grounded and connected by their city of London. Now, I'm moving on to the City Alewife, and I have another lovely glass here, lovely medieval glass, because I really couldn't talk to the glass sellers without talking about ale, beer, or wine. Now, I mentioned the Romans and barmaids, and here's another image of one of those Roman bars. Most commonly in London, they were tabernae, now, which is where the word tavern comes from. Now, you may be surprised to hear, or you may know, that Romans were not heavy drinkers. They drank very lightly. Their wine was watered down quite heavily. And in fact, Hippocras, the watered down white wine flavoured with herbs, is a thing that's often served at livery dinners. It's a thing that's passed around in the loving cup. However, the natives, the Britons, were not light drinkers. In fact, in 90 AD, Tacitus, on visiting London, rather dryly observed that they'd wasted their time attacking Britain with soldiers. They should have just got everyone drunk first. Now, of course, the Romans left in 410, but the natives kept on drinking. Now, I've got this picture here, just as an aside, wearing my City of London guide hat, because the remarkable thing about the city is, as I've said, this circularity. And we do think that the location of some of these Roman taverns became the alewives' alehouses, became the medieval pubs, became the Victorian pubs. Here we can see Talbot Yard, very close to the monument. You can see the Ship pub at the end. And it's pretty much thought that this is the site of a Roman tavern, because in the 1740s, workmen renovating the area uncovered a sewer or a Roman ditch that entirely followed the corner and was full of cups and gambling chips and the kind of things that were used in Roman taverns. So we probably are looking at a place in this photograph that was originally a Roman tavern. It did become an alehouse. And again, I come back to women. Now, if women in Roman taverns were barmaids, the situation in the early Anglo-Saxon and medieval period was very different, because women were not only the people serving the drink, they were the people making it and reaping the economic benefits of it. In fact, this was quite common across the world, but it's very much a case until the early 1400s in the city of London. If you were a man and you said you brewed beer, you'd probably be laughed at because it would seem so incredible. Now, this work was very important. Lots of beer was drunk in the city of London. It was very popular and it was quite a money spinner. And there were very good reasons for women to be the people making it. Number one, beer in those days was brewed from malt and barley. It didn't last for very long. It had a shelf life of about 2 weeks, so it had to be continually made. It was considered that women had a better palate and made tastier beer. And also it was useful for them because they could do it whilst looking after children and running the house. And actually it did stretch across the classes. So you would have a woman with a manor house who'd been supervising her servants while they made beer. It could be done on quite an industrial level, as you see from one picture. It could be quite refined, or it could be, frankly, quite disgusting. It could be a shack with very rough alcohol. Now, the alewives and their product was so popular that it caused terrible problems early on. And in fact, the Plantagenet kings were always passing laws to try and deal with it. There were huge problems with the fact that the peasantry, let alone the freemen, were often so drunk they couldn't do their work. And the idea of getting them to walk up and fight an enemy was incredible. So rules were passed, and one of the most notable ones was an alewife had to signify the fact that she was selling beer. She had to put a sign outside, and that is indeed the reason why pubs to this day tend to have such prominent wooden signs. The reason for that is the ale conner, or the person who checked the quality of the wine, knew she was brewing it and could come and make sure it wasn't being adulterated, poisoned, or she was serving short measures. This didn't work because the ale conners were fabulously bribable and quite often involved in the trade themselves. One thing they did do that's quite interesting is a measure of a drink was a peg, the size of a peg. And they'd test that these alewives were serving beer by the correct peg, and they'd tell them off if they weren't. And that's where the phrase taking someone down a peg or two comes from the Anglo-Saxon alewives and the potential misbehaviour. Now, by the 1400s, alewives were a very successful group of tradespeople. They contributed greatly to the city of London. They are listed, perhaps with not as much detail as you'd expect, by the Brewers Company. The Brewers Company have women brewers listed, and they had a particular look, rather like a Welsh national dress, pointy hat. You can see the depiction of this rather wealthy alewife with a sharp nose, her shrewd face. The little picture, the caricature, comes from the Paul Chester bequest, which lists details of woman brewers and is held at the Guildhall Library. And that little scribble is a picture of an alewife, and it's hard to tell whether she's wearing a medieval hat or whether she's been given spiky devil's horns. Now, this couldn't go on, and quite often when things go wrong for women, it's easy to attribute them to downright misogyny. It's not always the case. Quite often it's a result of simple technological advances. Now, the alewives really ran well because it needed to be a kitchen industry. But in the 1400s, a new beer started arriving from the continent. It was brewed with hops. Not only could you keep it for 3 or 4 months, because of that, you could store it in great big barrels. It's where now Friends of Coopers really start to come into their own. and you could use it as a commodity, you could trade it, it could go on ships. And as a result of that, it became more of a male trade. Men were more interested in getting involved. There was more money to make. The barrels were hard for women to handle. But the problem is, alewives were still popular. They were, after all, women with their own recipes and their own popularity. So there started to be quite a strong campaign against them. And it was a PR campaign. And the first strain of the PR campaign was that they were evil and they were sinful. And we start to see this, and this is fabulous. Look at this. One alewife is being eaten by a demon. The other one's got a list of all her misdemeanors, and there she is being carried off. But good woman, she hasn't let go of her glass of beer. And here's a particular favourite of mine. This is a church wall painting. And actually, the alewife doesn't look quite very unhappy in hell. And that's a very friendly, cuddly, drunk-looking demon there. So it doesn't look too bad. Now, City of London alewives really did hang on and continue to be powerful for quite a while. Their business was run on a bigger scale, and they were members of livery companies, and they just had more support. But the propaganda against women brewers mounted, and they were depicted as ugly harridans. They were accused of putting everything from dead chickens to feces into the beer and poisoning it, and increasingly the battle was lost. And one little anthropological add-on is there's a real debate about this, but some people feel that these women who came to be depicted in such a negative way, you can see this woman here with warts on her nose, they wore pointed hats. They made things with cauldrons that made men behave badly. They used broomsticks to signify that they were brewing, and they kept cats to keep mice under control because they were using barley. It has been suggested that that's where the model for the modern European witch came from. But the thing that has to be said is really the thing that happened to the alewives is that new technology made it more difficult for them to do things that women had to do and make money. But for several hundred years, they were the providers of beer in this country. Now, if they're considered to be, especially towards the end of the 1400s, to have been women who were slightly disreputable and produced sometimes a rather rough product, I'm going to move on to a woman who made her way in the City of London in a way that we can all appreciate, because we all have something in common with Alice, because Alice was in a livery company. Alice was a freeman of the City of London, and Alice gave a great deal of money to charity and good causes. And what surprises people quite often is that that could happen so early on. And I'm talking here about the early 1400s. Now, in this map here, you can see Soper Lane, that's Cheapside. You can just see the bottom of Ironmonger Lane there, both roads that are still there to this day. And in the background, that image is of Cheapside, the most important shopping street in London until Regent Street was open in the Georgian era. And Soper Lane was the centre of a very particular industry. It's where the London silkwives operated. And they operated there through the medieval period. And here are some images of them. Their job was to produce all the beautiful things. You know, we think of the mercers and the cloth workers. You know, mercers, very wealthy people, merchant tailors. But their cloth and clothing was not expensive until these women had worked their magic on it, because they were responsible for the lace, the gauze, the buttons, the trimmings. It was highly skilled work. In true City of London tradition, the way that you got to become a silkwife was you were sent here, you were an apprentice, you were bound, you were an apprentice for several years, you produced your masterpiece, you came to our court, the Chamberlain's Court in the City of London, and you got your freedom of the city. Because this is one thing, women have for many hundreds of years been able to have the freedom of the City of London. Alice Claver came here as a young woman, probably from Northampton, in about 1410, and did just that, and turned up at the Chamberlain's Court and received her freedom and became a free sister of the City of London. But it wasn't just a case of being very good and becoming a rich, successful businesswoman. This made you extremely desirable on the marriage market, and the most desirable husband for a young silk wife was a very rich mercer. You had to be very good at your trade to land one, and that's exactly what Alice did, because she married, in her 20s, she married Richard Claver, a wealthy widower and a mercer. And this is what's fascinating about this. She married him, she became his chattel, but because of Sole Femme and her freedom from the Chamberlain's Court, she could still operate independently through the marriage. And this is when we start hearing about her. We hear about the alewives because they're losing their grip on their industry. We hear about Alice because she's making money. When her husband dies, he makes her the executive of the will, and he doesn't have to leave her anything because, as she points out, she has quite enough of her own. She doesn't need to be left anything. In fact, she ends up with all his wealth anyway. He has a son from his first marriage, and she outlives him, as is often the case with women in the city. So what did she do with all this wealth? Well, she spent most of it on charity and largely training other girls, helping widows, helping find jobs for young men. And the other things she does is she she's an excellent saleswoman. She becomes preeminent. She's not long before she's making the clothes for Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. And on the next screen, I'm going to show you some of her customers. So here we have, that's Elizabeth Woodville. So this would have been when she's making things for Edward IV. And it's highly likely that she was responsible for the gold fabric trimming and also that lovely, almost translucent gauze that she's wearing over her headdress. Subsequently, Alice Claver was responsible for the clothes of Richard III, including his wedding raiments. That would have been the trim and all the embroidery. And when he was deposed, of course, she went on to clothe the new brash royals, the Tudors. She was extremely rich when she died, but not only that, she was a livery person through and through. Now, for some reason, we don't know why, she wasn't very keen on joining the Mercers. Maybe she thought they were boring, or maybe she had enough of time spent with them with her husband. Funnily enough, she joined the Worshipful Company of Founders, probably because by then she was living on Ironmonger Lane, big house, and they were close by. We know that when she died, she left bequests mainly to women. She left her business and most of her money to her most talented apprentice. She also left large amounts of money to St. Lawrence Jewry, where she was interred, where she was buried. She paid for the floor in the original church. And the funny thing is, that's a pattern for women in the city. They've been able to take advantage of all the official routes and trades in just the same way that men were at the time. And I just have to show you one other thing that I find remarkable about Elizabeth Claver. When we're talking about men and women in the city, women were often trusted. This is lace. This is at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's not on display because can you believe it was actually made in the City of London in the early 1400s. It's the best lace in the world. And towards the end of the 1400s, there was a risk of our lace makers and silk women losing out to cheap imports from Europe. Alice Claver actually went to Parliament and also spoke to the King and arranged for this not to happen. So she was not only important, she was persuasive and respected. And funnily enough, silk women, very important trade. And I was talking about the fact that you can't find signs of women in the city. You know, you hunt around to look for them. But funnily enough, silk women are probably the thing you can find. Here's a picture of the Mercer's Maiden. Of course, Alice's husband was a mercer. And there have been lots of discussions about who she depicts. people have suggested a Virgin Mary or a Queen, you know. Those who are being unkind to the Mercers suggest she's a bosomy barmaid, which, to be fair, they did own a lot of pubs. But the likelihood is she is a depiction of a silk wife. Silk wives wore crowns and beads and decorations to advertise their wares, and almost always married mercers. So it's quite possible that when you're walking around in the city or Covent Garden and you look up and see a mercer's maiden, you're kind of looking at Alice. So I give her a quick wave because she was definitely a good one. Now here you are. Now I've got some beautiful glasses. I'm really, really taken with these, and I'm sure you all know far more about them than me, but these were actually apparently made in the city of London by a famous glassmaker, and they're really rather beautiful. And the lady I'm going to talk about now is quite the kind of person who might once have held one of these glasses. But she's very different to Alice Claver, because she's someone who got somewhere despite setbacks. It was a sheer force of personality. Now, Amelia Bassano was an Elizabethan. She was born in London in 1625, right on the edge, right on the east of London, very close to Shoreditch. She was a daughter of Baptiste Bassano, a Venetian musician. He'd been shipped over from Venice, probably of Jewish background originally, to work for Elizabeth I at her court. So the young Amelia would have had a really interesting upbringing because she would have grown up on the edge of Bishopsgate. It was an area that was an immigrant area, as Shoreditch and Spitalfields still are. It was also full of actors and musicians. The Curtain Theatre was there when Shakespeare started, but it also had the houses of rich merchants, rich city merchants. And on the other hand, her father knew Elizabeth I, and she was brought up with an awareness of courtly manners and good behaviour. Well, Amelia must have been a very charming child, because when her father died, he died in 1576, and her mother was having problems coping. She was sent into the household of this lady. Now, this is Elizabeth Bertie, the Countess of Kent, who had a very grand house in Moorgate. You can see she's rather beautiful and richly adorned. She was also a clever woman, and like any good humanist Protestant, she believed that girls should be educated. And Amelia's position, she was probably kind of like a senior servant, a professional companion. But what she received in the household was a really good education, not only religion and domestic management, but philosophy, classics, and most importantly, literature. Well, this was a pattern for the young Amelia's life. She went on to live with the Clifford family. This is a picture of Margaret Clifford, the Countess of Cumberland. They were famous for having the most fantastic library. And the young Amelia was able to sit there reading all these amazing and very rare and expensive books. And finally, of course, probably about the only queen to actually appear in my talk, Elizabeth I, who was friendly with both of these women and, of course, had known Amelia's father. So it's not surprising that this daughter of Venetian immigrants should turn out like this. We believe that this is a painting of Amelia Bassano. She looked quite different to other women of the time. She was apparently very dark-skinned, very swarthy. She looked very Italian and very dark-haired. And she spent her life just moving from aristocratic house to aristocratic house. She could play instruments, she could speak 2 or 3 languages. She was very well read. It was all going very well until her mother died when she was 18. And the realization then that she may spend time with these people, but she was still basically the daughter of an immigrant with no money, and musicians and actors were quite disreputable. All she had was her education, her looks, and her cultured behaviour. And she took the route that lots of women have taken before her, which is to become the mistress of, for want of a better word, a sugar daddy. Henry Carey, 40 years older than her. He also happened to be the Lord Chamberlain and the first cousin of Elizabeth I. Now, this might leave a rather uncomfortable taste in her mouth today, but actually it was a relationship that seemed to work quite well. She later wrote that he treated her with respect. He was interested in her intellect and discussing books. And no doubt he kept her in very high style. And it was all working very, very well until perhaps the inevitable happened in 1592 and she became pregnant. And that really wasn't going to do at all. But because, you know, Henry Carey was her protector, she was liked at court, she was simply married off to her cousin, Alfonso Lanier, who she didn't like very much, but she didn't have much choice in the matter. And at that point, Amelia risks becoming a real footnote to the history of great men. Because here's another thing about Amelia. She's suggested to be a major candidate to be the Dark Lady of William Shakespeare's sonnets. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One is she almost definitely knew him, because 2 years after her marriage, ex-lover Henry Carey formed an acting troupe with William Shakespeare as its actor-manager, and we know that Amelia was still on very good terms with Henry Carey. His first theatre was just up the road from where her family lived, and lots of the musicians she knew would have known Shakespeare. She was indeed a dark lady. She was educated, she wrote poetry, she was quite sharp and witty. And people point to the fact that in The Merchant of Venice, set in Venice, you have Bassanio. And then, of course, a character in Othello is Amelia. Now, to me, this is no proof. It's a nice idea, but there's no proof of any of this. But Amelia Bassano Lanier is much more interesting in her own right. I'm going to stick with her maiden name here, actually. Here's another picture. I'm going to show it to you because I love it. This is a miniature by Hillier. And again, it's very heavily suspected that this is a picture of Amelia Bassano. And I think you'll all agree that usually his pictures have quite good likeness, and if it is, she's rather beautiful. And somebody who thought she was very attractive again was the astrologer Simon Forman. Now, it was a hobby of wealthy women to go and visit an astrologer every so often. Everybody did it. It was like having Reiki or the kind of things that people do now with their spare time. And he wrote very unflatteringly about Amelia. He said she was grasping, ungrateful, ambitious, had ideas beyond her station. A lot of this might be coloured by the fact that she seems to have refused his advances and refused to sleep with him. But one thing he was certainly correct about her was she was ambitious. I mentioned poetry, and throughout her unhappy marriage, she wrote poetry. This was quite a common hobby for Tudor women. You know, it's a thing they did in their spare time, write their lover a little note, write their husband a poem, write the Queen a poem. But not Amelia. She'd written a whole book full, and she wanted to get them published. And really, very few people but Amelia, under the circumstances, would have got her poems published, but she was very crafty and very astute. She dedicated every single one of these poems to one of those powerful women, including the Queen herself. So who was going to say no to that? And indeed, in 1610, we find her wandering over to Stationers' Hall, Abergavenny House as it was then, to register her book of poetry to be published. And indeed, it is the first book of poetry by a woman published in the English language. It's very traditional in a way. It's religious. Who can criticize that? But it is quietly subversive, a bit like The Woman, because she writes poems from the point of view of the women in the Bible, including Pontius Pilate's wife, who of course warns him, has the bad dream and warns him against convicting Jesus. She even suggests that as Adam is obviously so superior in every way to Eve, that perhaps he should take some responsibility for the fall of women. Now, I would love to say that this marvelous book of poetry made her wealthy or gained her great recognition, but it didn't. She continued to live a somewhat fractious life, including court cases, but it was a long life. She died in 1645 and she was pensioned, so she was still being looked after. And although her writing, you can see here, you can still buy books of her writing and have been able to over the last 20 or 30 years, she was still sort of shadowed by this reputation of being a dark woman. But rather fortunately, in 2018, some of you might have seen it, there was a smash hit play on the West End and in Broadway, written by Morgan Lloyd Malcolm, based on the life of Emilia Bassano Lanier. It's great fun, and I do recommend going to see it when it comes back on. Now, I'm on to my last lady today, and this is I'm calling her the Unstoppable Lady Fanshawe, and in a way I've left the best till last, because I can't quite believe this woman. She's quite the opposite again from Emilia. She was born in London with every advantage in 1625. So Emilia Bassano Lanier is still alive at that point, but she's just being born. And she was born in London and christened St Olaf Hart Street. You can see a picture there. Her father, John Harrison, was the head of customs and a member, and that's the Customs House in what's now Billingsgate. And at the bottom you can see Balls Park House, which is their Hertfordshire country home. He was an MP, he was a rich man, he was very respected. Now here's a picture of the young Lady Anne Harrison. There she is, Lady Anne Harrison. And there's a scene. I mean, to be quite honest, when she was 15, her mother died. She was running the estate. She was obviously very capable. And all she could have looked forward to was hopefully a good marriage and a life of ease and relaxation. By the time she hit her teens, the family had suffered a near complete reversal because the country was lurching into civil war, and Sir John Harrison was a royalist. He'd lent all his money to Charles I, always a very foolish thing to do. It was gone in nanoseconds virtually. The house in Balls Park had been completely ransacked, and they weren't popular in the city of London anymore, which was staunchly Cromwellian. And in fact, they were forced to flee to Oxford to join Charles I at his alternative court there. In some poverty, she reports that they were all in one room above a baker's shop with just one meal a day. However, it was not all disastrous for the young Lady Anne, because she met and fell in love with her cousin, first cousin, Sir Richard Fanshawe, and here's a rather splendid picture of him. It's actually not an inaccurate expression of his personality, because he was a cultured, measured man. And he was a very good friend of Prince Charles, and very closely involved in the fight for the royalists. And so off he went, travelling around the country. He was caught at one siege. She got him released by going to see Cromwell himself. She was a very determined lady, but it still would have been expected, really, when war fully broke out, that she would have gone into exile or hidden herself. But not Anne Fanshawe. She was just made of really stern stuff. She took off across the country in a cart with a couple of servants, travelling around from place to place, trying to raise money for the king and her husband's cause. And I'm just going to show you a couple of prints produced in London from the period that show you the viciousness of this war. Here you've got depictions of the royalists and the Roundheads, comparing them really. And here is this rather horrifying woodcut, which gives you an idea of what the country was like. She was travelling across a country which peppered with atrocities, sieges, burnt and looted cities and towns, homeless people, brigands, robbers, the starving. It was incredibly dangerous, but it didn't daunt this woman, and she just carried on. And of course, ultimately, in 16 in 1649, the war was lost and they became refugees, and then started an even more difficult chapter of her life. She and her husband had to split up and run around Europe, basically, trying not to be captured by Cromwell's agents. And she has a number of near misses. Someone shoots at her while she's heavily pregnant, and she survives despite being winged. She manages to get out of Cork just before in Ireland, just before Cromwell's forces roll in and set siege to it. She does this right under his nose at night on a cart whilst heavily pregnant. But my favourite story, and the most indicative one I can think of about Lady Fanshawe, is at one point she and her husband were travelling together in the Bay of Malta, and they were confronted by absolutely the worst sight a traveller could encounter: a large Barbary pirate ship. Now, people are particularly terrified of these ships because they would capture travellers on other ships and then sell them into slavery in North Africa. Well, immediately the sailors decide to bundle the woman, Lady Fanshawe, into a cabin and lock her in, lest she become hysterical. Well, she's having nothing of it. She bribes a cabin boy to exchange clothes, dresses up at him, and goes and joins her husband on deck. Fortunately, on that occasion, the Barbary pirates decide they don't fancy the look of the ship, and they sail on, leaving them unmolested. She must have been incredibly relieved when all this came to an end, and the restoration happened in 1660. And one thing I do have to say that any of the women listening to this will find absolutely amazing is during this 30 years of calamities and travel, she was almost constantly pregnant. She lost either to early death or miscarriage somewhere in the region of 16 children, and only 2 or 3 survived. So you can imagine when this happened, she must have been looking forward to an easy life. Her husband's best friend has become king after all. But he decides to send her husband off to broker his marriage to Catherine of Braganza. And you can see a picture here of Charles II, now king, with Catherine, brokered by Sir Richard Fanshawe. So successful is this that Charles decides that the couple and their remaining children should go and become ambassador and take on the role of ambassador to the Portuguese court. Well, she was a very loyal wife. She followed her husband to Portugal, and sadly in 1666 he died suddenly. Well, this really indicates what kind of man Charles II was, because despite all this loyalty, he'd barely paid Richard during his time in Portugal, and he refused to pay for the body to be returned to London. This outraged the Portuguese royal family, who offered to pay for it themselves, but only on condition that Anne become Catholic. Well, Anne was having none of this at all. She dug her heels in and refused to move, keeping the body for some time in her apartment until the Portuguese Dowager Duchess, the mother of the king, took pity on her and paid for it herself. Now, you'd think that this would be quite enough for one woman, but this is actually, none of this is what Lady Anne Fanshawe is famous for. She is famous for her writing, and she is particularly famous for this, her recipe books, because she inherited, when she took over her estate, the recipe books and receipt books of her mother. Now, during these years, she not only lost all those children, she lost her pearls, she lost all her property was stolen, she lost everything. But somehow or the other, she never lost these books. And they are the most remarkable record of real life and existence and survival. And they have some fascinating things in them. For example, here, you may see the little pot on the left, is the first recipe in English for hot chocolate. And the picture on the other side shows it being made according to her recipe. She's also responsible for the first recipe in English for ice cream. And here again, we have the recipe for ice cream. So interesting are these books. And one edition had a foreword written by Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf has been an admirer because she's written forwards to quite a lot of the editions of books by Lady Fanshawe. They also contain little recordings of places, medicines, and they show how in the background it was women quietly and industriously keeping things together, keeping things going, no matter what the challenges were. Now you can actually buy 2 of Lady Fanshawe's books. She's still published. The memoirs she wrote, which is basically a hagiography of her husband, are very important for anyone studying the Civil War period. It's just a shame there's not more of her in there. But Lady Fanshawe's receipt book remains fascinating. And I've just included on the left-hand side there a little decoration that was of Lady Fanshawe in late life that used to be on sale in the Museum of London. Now, I could go on for ages. There's at least another 15 women, but I think that's enough. And I hope that that little introduction, that little taster of the kind of women who traded, why women lost their business, how women spent their time, shows you that things are quite different in the past, but they're also kind of the same. And in some ways, what women are doing in the city now is what they've always been doing. And the fact that perhaps there aren't the statues and the records and the medals there to celebrate us is not so much a problem when you consider we have things like, dare I say, ice cream. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully I know some of the answers.
Laura, unbelievable. Absolutely brilliant.
Astonishing, brilliant.
So,
very good.
I think I might have run over a bit there. So sorry about that.
No worry at all.
Oh, amazing.
I went very quickly.
So, well, thank you for listening. So that's a
Really, I mean, your research is extraordinary, and the illustrations and you produced just brought it all to life.
Do you have a part 2 which carries on?
yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes, I run all the way up to the last lady I talk about dies in the 1990s.
Well, we will book you probably in the autumn and have part 2.
Okay, lovely,
Yes.
lovely.
Yeah.
Tell me, Laura, would you rather have been an alewife or a silk wife?
I think I'd have rather been a silk wife. But it depends on the alewife, because some of the alewives were very wealthy, so I might not have minded being a City of London Brewster. A City of London brewer would have been good. I don't think I'd have liked to have done it, been at the lower. It's the same with all these things, you know, when you talk about them, you've always got the top end and the bottom end. You've got the, and actually, it has to be said that the women in the City of London are usually at the top, really. It has to be said. It's the best place to do most things.
Do you think you could have given Lady Fanshawe a run for her money?
Oh, no. I mean, to be quite honest, I think my sympathies probably would have rested with the Roundheads. But there is actually another splendid woman on the and in fact, on the Roundhead side, many people aren't aware that there were these amazing fortifications dug, huge fortifications dug around the city to defend it from royalist forces, and they were dug by women. And there are images and reports of very, very wealthy mercers' wives and very, very poor common City of London drabs, as they call them, both standing there side by side with big shovels building these. You know, another thing I note is that, you know, it's quite interesting how the women tend to mix together when they're challenged, you know, and the Civil War is particularly. But Lady Fanshawe is quite a remarkable woman. It's not all in there. I mean,
16 children. I mean,
It might be more. We have problems working it out because you read the account of her life of her husband, and it is all about him. But then you receive the receipt book, and she makes little notes, and there are quite a lot of them. And there's a really sad one where she's got a recipe for curing smallpox that she's carefully written down. And then shortly afterwards, 2 of her children die of smallpox, and the cure hasn't helped. And of course, tearing across Europe in very dangerous days and very bad weather. But you know, she lived to a pretty decent age for the time, so you know.
I mean, she must have been a formidable character. 16 children and doing all that sort of
Yeah,
work as well,
she was quite amazing.
and surviving all
physically
that,
strong.
all those births. I mean, just incredible.
She was interesting because there were early indications that she might have been a little bit out of the ordinary. Her mother died when she was 15, and she ended up taking over the estate. But she did report that she was constantly in trouble before them for being a hoyten, which is like hoyden. It's the original version, and so being a tomboy and being in trouble and fighting and falling out trees. So she always had perhaps a sort of element of being perhaps a bit of an adventurous.
Gosh.
You know.
Well, I can, in a way, rival that. My cousin Raymond Layard and I have a forebear who went to Ceylon in the early 19th century, married a 16-year-old Dutch girl, daughter of the governor of Gaul, and she bore him 26 children.
Oh my God.
21 of whom survived into adulthood.
It was common then.
Terribly bad television signal in Sri Lanka.
It is quite funny. I mean, there have been the occasional sort of dramatisation. There was a thing with Angela Risborough several years ago where she played a Civil War woman, and there are bits of Lady Fanshawe in that story.
Right.
Not completely, but
What was the musical that Amelia Lanya's life was?
It's called Amelia.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, and it's interspersed with music, and it's not entirely accurate. It sort of sees her because people have considered whether she might almost have been North African, because a lot of Venetians were of North African. So she's sort of she definitely by Elizabethan standards was not white. So this play has 4 different actresses. And it's really about being passed around, and this business with Shakespeare and the Dark Lady. I mean, you know, she's an interesting one too.
Yeah, fascinating.
Well, the Bassano family are still going. I mean, one of the descendants of her family to this day is a conductor. I'm quite a good one.
Fascinating.
I've heard one of the things about the women brewers with the pointed hats and the brooms when they did the witches' hunt, and that was one of the ways to get rid of the women having the power of the brewers, because they knew all the herbs and everything, and they just got destroyed.
Yeah, it's a possibility that there are a series of trades, and women often, if they worked, would tie their hair back and wear a tall hat.
Yes.
And obviously women were often older because they lived longer than men then as now. And so you have to be careful not to overstate it, because it may not, there are other characters, there are other depictions. But I can't help feeling that it was perhaps too easy to sort of ruin their reputations because of this. Interestingly, Anne O'Connor's often continued for some time to be female.
Wow.
Why is it we've never heard much about these people?
It's because the evidence isn't there in front of us. It's because the evidence isn't there in front of us, and it's because records aren't obviously kept. We know a bit about alewives simply through culture, through carvings, through sculptures, They're mentioned in things like Chaucer, but there isn't a lot of written information. And it's only when you have women owning property that you start to get a trail. So, for example,
Yes.
with Alice Claver, we only know about her once she gets married.
Yes, it's interesting that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all the emphasis on the male,
Yeah. So, yeah.
on men.
Yeah, so, but on the other hand, you know, it has to be said that there are a lot of men whose lives and things would not have been recorded either. And there are other problems such as the destruction of records during the Second World War and the Civil War,
Yes.
the Great Fire. That hasn't helped in the city either.
No.
Because we've lost a lot.
Quite true.
Be
Jenny, you're muted.
I was very surprised when you started off your talk saying that there were more women in the city than men. Did they have a census at the time? I mean, this is surprising.
It's pretty much a firm indication to start with, just demographically and scientifically. There are generally, throughout history in this country, always more women than men. There are more women than men now in London. So when London was residential, there would have been more women. I mean, to bring us back to COVID, for example, women were much less likely to die of things like the Black Death and the plague and cholera. They survived. If they survived childbirth, women were likely quite often to live into the 60s or 70s. And we can see this because records were kept. And one of the records that were kept were deaths. Death records have been kept for a long time with the age at death. And it's very noticeable that the women die at a much older age than the men. So even with childbirth, basically, while we were still residential, there would have been more women. And the other thing is with things like the Civil War, every time there is an epidemic, like the Black Death, for example, is a good example, it wipes out the men and the women step in. And this is one of the reasons why as a woman, you're allowed to become part of a livery and why you could get the freedom, because you're expected to step in to your husband or your brother's or your son's business. Alice Claver is a good example. She outlives her husband, she outlives his son, she outlives her husband's nephews. And when she has a group of women who are the same age as her in the same trade that organise charities. It's just biological, really. So it changed after the war, not after the war, after the Great Fire, because that's when London stopped being somewhere where people lived and became somewhere where people could work.
Laura, I think we must probably wrap up for this evening. We could go on talking all night.
I can hear my dinner being prepared in the background. So.
Yes, Paul has already booked you, I'm sure, for part 2.
Yes, very much.
Well, thank you very much. As long as you weren't bored, there were lots of people.
No.
It was a brilliant presentation.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. I mean, amazingly put together. It was riveting, fascinating, and revealed things about London and women in London that I'd never known before. It was tremendous. Thank you so much indeed. And we will wait for part 2, part 3, part 4, whatever. All over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Master.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you, Master. That's I think that sums up the evening. I'm still trying to absorb it all. I'm going to watch the video again, I think, because I tried to take notes, but I wasn't writing fast enough. All I would say to everybody is next week we're having a week off. It's a very busy week in the city. The Master is going to one of his first events since taking office. We are having our own event on Tuesday, and then Wednesday I am playing with the Fellowship of Clerks, and on Thursday we have the election of the sheriffs. So busy week, And the following week, the 29th, on the Tuesday instead of a Thursday, we will be having a gentleman by the name of Stephen Skelton, who is a well-known wine grower, winemaker, and has written numerous books on wine. And he's going to tell us about the Englishman that developed glass bottles for wine. So that will be Tuesday the 29th. And on that note, I would wish you all a very good evening. Have a lovely weekend. I hope the sunshine comes back for us all, although my garden is smiling dearly at the rain that's coming down. Good night and God bless to everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Very good.